Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway. Gayatri is off voting in Indonesia. We'll talk to her later. Julian Assange is behind bars and in the hands of the UK justice system, where a request for his extradition to the United States will in due course be heard and heard and heard. Not since Oscar Wilde's conviction, which led to Reading jail, will a more exotic courtroom drama have riveted the nation and, this time, the world. Our first guest has been a central figure in the ballad of Julian Assange from the start. A former army officer, he gave over his country home to Assange and put up thousands for his bail. Having lost most of it, he's still in the fight on the publisher's side. He's Vaughan Smith, and he joins us now. Thanks for coming on board the Sputnik, Vaughan. You know Julian Assange very well. He lived with you. You've known him a decade. Do you recognise the Julian Assange that is being painted in the mainstream media today?
No, George, thanks for having me, but absolutely no, I don't. He's being portrayed as somebody who, wipes faces over the walls, that tortures a cat. He's not like that at all. I know him better than most. I've known him for 10 years. I've been visiting him fortnightly for the last 6 months. He's somebody who is very amusing. He's somebody who's very engaging, somebody who passionately believes and gets up every morning passionately believing that what he's doing is in the public interest, that what he's doing is fighting for better freedom of speech, for transparency, for more accountability in government. So, no, he's somebody who, everybody I've introduced him to, because I used to bring some friends along to the embassy to keep him company, they all found him very engaging and not at all the way he was portrayed.
The picture includes, as you've alluded, some pretty grisly stuff. I visited him regularly at the embassy too in the days when one could. I never noticed issues of hygiene. I never took him for a man that would torture a cat or smear excrement on the walls. Why is this narrative so prevalent, do you think?
Well, I have a theory, and by the way, I can reassure you that he's not at all like that. I've never noticed, having known him this long, and he stayed with me for 13 months, that any sort of personal hygiene issues, anything beyond what I was like when I was a bachelor. I mean, it's ridiculous. However, I have checked up on this. I've spoken to all the people that have visited him consistently. He's always had sort of legal assistance available to him when he's in the embassy, and they've said that it's absolute rubbish. But I know what's happening. I mean, he delivered, or WikiLeaks did, the INA papers, and these suggest that the Ecuadorian president's family are corrupt. At the same time, Ecuador, by throwing him out of the embassy or inviting the British police to come in and take him out, are breaking international law. That was tested in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the Ecuadorians lost the case against Julian. So they broke international law, and they also got a $4.2 billion loan from the Americans a couple of weeks ago. So I think myself that this is really a smokescreen, and I think it's part of a wider orchestrated campaign to diminish Julian as a person in our eyes, to reduce the public empathy and sympathy for him. And this is very dangerous because actually it's the public that will suffer if Julian is sent off to America. The public will see somebody who's fighting for what they believe in the public interest taken off and made an example of, because this is vengeance, this is vengeful. It's deeply unpleasant, and it's coordinated, and the Ecuadorian president has come up and said things that don't seem to be challenged properly by journalists. Oh, by the way, the cat's fine, it's with a family member. It's all silly. We're talking about a cat and personal hygiene when there are really important issues about transparency. Julian brought this up 10 years ago. He started the debate on transparency and how governments should be held to account. But we're not talking about that, and it's important, isn't it?
Wasn't the turning point for what I'll loosely call the Liberals when WikiLeaks began revealing secrets leaked to them about Hillary Clinton, the framing of Bernie Sanders, the cheating of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party's primary. That flipped a class of people, didn't it?
Oh, it completely did. I think a lot of supporters, or people who would now be supporting Julian, were very turned off by what appeared to look like, to them, a betrayal of, of Hillary Clinton and letting Trump in. But I think you've got the finger on the pulse there, because actually it was much to do with Clinton's betrayal of Bernie Sanders. But you see, the way I look at it, George, is if you look at all the newspapers we read here, there are none that are impartial. They're all partial. I think Julian isn't partial myself particularly. I think he does exactly what it says on the tin on WikiLeaks, which is if you put something in his secure Dropbox, he'll check it out. If it's true, he'll push it out as best he can. We can't choose the truths that we want to subscribe to and believe that we believe in freedom of speech and truth. So we just have to suck it up a bit. Also, people think that he did it to protect himself. They got him so wrong. He's an enormously courageous person. He knows his destiny is going to be difficult, and yet he still carried on. But he expected, like we all did, that Hillary Clinton would still win. So he thought he'd just have a very angry American government. Well, he's got an angry American government and a vindictive American government.
It is odd that, isn't it? President Trump used to regularly quote WikiLeaks on the campaign trail, and now he doesn't remember who they are.
Oh, it's bizarre, isn't it? It's bizarre. But the other thing that's quite interesting is a lot of journalists thought that this extradition was going to be all to do with the Mueller inquiry, but it hasn't been to do with the Mueller inquiry so far. This is stuff that's been brought back from 10 years ago, when Julian claimed and received diplomatic asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, which has been recognised by the highest authority in the world, the United Nations Working Group for Arbitrary Detention. So the UN is supporting it. All these supranationals are supporting Julian in this. It's the governments that are not. When they recognise that, he said it was to avoid US extradition. He's been proved right, and the press were all saying, "Oh no, it's not. You're running away." So that's why I wasn't too upset.
Well, the deck is clear now. That's true, and there is only one count. It does relate to the alleged war crimes footage of the Iraq war logs, the best possible ground to fight on, I should have thought, and in any case, well worth going to the wall, to the stake for. But of course, that charge on which they seek extradition is merely what I think you called a can opener, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Oh, and it needs to be understood. It's been framed and promoted as that they're going for him for hacking, which is, a term that people frown on. Though I think some hackers are very decent people.
The Daily Telegraph did a good job with hacking MPs' expenses.
Well, absolutely. No, that's a very good point. I mean, hacking's fine if one approves of it, but so they've labelled him a hacker because there's a perception that this is not going to receive public support.
Except he didn't hack, and neither did the Daily Telegraph.
No, absolutely.
They received.
They received, yeah. No, it's a very important point. I'm glad you said that, George, because but there's something else very important here too. The extradition warrant talks about him helping now Chelsea Manning, but she was then called Bradley Manning, crack into military computers. But actually all he did, because Manning was already able to do that, he showed her how to do it securely so she couldn't be traced. It was about protecting sources, which is a fundamental journalistic responsibility. So those people who are saying he's a hacker, actually, no. This was a journalistic activity. He's a publisher. He's received, 20 journalism awards, so a lot of journalists recognise him as a journalist.
The United States justice system is not famous around the world because of its politicized nature. The president appoints the Supreme Court and so on, and it's a big political issue in America. Who's going to be top dog in the judicial system? Yet Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon paper man, the man who revealed the truth about US war crimes in Vietnam, he won against the government at every level in the United States judicial system. Have you abandoned hope that Julian Assange could win in the US courts?
Well, I don't I'm not a lawyer. I don't presume to know. But what I do know is Julian does not want to go to America. He believes he'll be thrown into the American gulag. I mean, he believes that it's a punishment, that it's vindictive, and that I'm not personally saying that I think he will receive the death sentence. I don't believe that's true, but I believe he will receive life imprisonment. I think they will be quite brutal to him, and I think it's wrong. And it's all about communicating to others, to discourage others, because the enormity of what WikiLeaks has done, it's opened something up that can be replicated by others. And I feel strongly this is because of a failure of journalists to look after sources. It's a failure of journalism to really take on power the way that we're charged to, but are not doing enough of. So in a sense, you end up with Julian slightly being despised by journalists because I think he makes them feel guilty too often.
Lastly, if Julian Assange is punished for publishing stolen material in the way that the Telegraph published stolen material on expenses, what of the great newspapers around the world that published the material that Julian Assange himself published? Some of the biggest names in the journalistic firmament. Aren't they, by extension, guilty of the same crime as Julian Assange? In which case, why are they cheering so loudly at his apparent demise?
I think they're beginning to appreciate the risk to themselves by this. And there seems to be a position being taken by some very good newspapers normally, I would suggest, except I don't agree with them on this issue, where they suggest that he shouldn't be extradited for that. But then what they do is they kick him anyway, personally. So it's almost as if it's too much for a newspaper in this country or America to support him wholeheartedly. What they've got to do if they want to support him against extradition is talk about him smelling or talk about him, bullying cats, which is complete rubbish. So it's quite interesting. It's almost like they need that to be able to push for what may be valuable to them. But it all boils down to the relationship they had with him, the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, during the original leaks 10 years ago by Manning. That relationship didn't go as well as it could have done because newspapers, unsurprisingly, are run by strong characters. Julian is a strong character. The best journalists are incredibly strong characters. They're not always seem to be reasonable people. That's why they're great, because they persevere. And I think they're making a real mistake because what they're doing is they're easing the route for Julian to be extradited by personally attacking him, because that's very much the strategy being used against Julian. It's the public that will save Julian.
Thanks very much. Coming up after the break, more on Julian Assange. Welcome back to Sputnik. I'm talking with Vaughan Smith, the former British Army officer who gave over his own home to Julian Assange for more than 1 year, who put up thousands of pounds for his bail, lost most of it, but who is still gallantly, as a British Army officer should, in the fight. Vaughan, let's go back to the personal. The international editor of Channel 4 News, Lindsay Hilsum, tweeted that Julian seemed like a demented gnome when being carried out of the embassy. He's clearly been damaged by such a long period of very peculiar incarceration, kind of incarceration that would never be tolerated in a jail, for example, not able to go outside and exercise and so on. But he's clearly been damaged, but he'd have a right to be damaged. Wouldn't he tell us something about the conditions inside the embassy?
Well, I mean, I have great respect for Lindsay Hilsum, but in this case, I think she's got it wrong. I thought he looked more like Ai Weiwei. I think Julian's a dissident rather than a demented person. Were he demented, which he's not, I'd be inclined to blame the Ecuadorian hospitality over the last year. For the first 5-6 years, the Ecuadorians were extremely friendly to Julian, and the regime changed. The political situation changed entirely because a different government came in, led by Lenin Moreno, who sought to revise their relationship with America. They recently have secured a 4.2 million loan, a billion loan, sorry, which I understand is linked. However, what happened in the last year was really grim for Julian. He lost his internet access. He found that his visitations were curtailed. He was no longer able to talk to journalists. He was gagged. He had extra cameras put in every room. So he was monitored all the time. So not only did he have no outside space, but he couldn't do anything without being on camera and being listened to. It's deeply unpleasant.
Of course, there is an argument, the British government, whether here would make it, that you can't skip bail willy-nilly. You can't not be punished for skipping bail. The British taxpayer was cost a lot of money, some say as much as £20 million for the policing bill around the embassy. I don't think anyone would have that much to complain about if Assange had been given a jail sentence for skipping bail. The extradition issue is going to be very much more troublesome for everyone involved. I was in Parliament when David Blunkett, the then Home Secretary, during the summer holidays when no one was there to question it in Parliament, signed the current extradition deal with the US government, which is possibly the most one-sided extradition deal ever signed by anyone. The United States now no longer even needs to show just cause or make a prima facie case before extradition is secured, which is one way, by the way, because no American citizen will ever be extradited to Britain, as many British governments have found in the past. Is this going to be a long one, this extradition fight? How well tooled up is the Assange camp legally?
There are some very committed lawyers and some pretty well-known ones trying to help Julian. So I think he's very well served legally. I agree with you about the extradition. We have very weak extradition laws, and it's inconceivable that the British government would have used our police to take somebody who'd received diplomatic asylum out of an embassy for China or for Russia. I mean, that's obviously wouldn't have happened. So when Pamela Anderson says we're just America's, maybe we are, you know, I mean, maybe Ecuador is too. But the point you said about the police, I think, is quite interesting. We didn't need to fund the police outside the embassy. We did that to impress the Americans. That was our choice. It's not his fault. What is he? He's not a violent man. Had he walked out, he's one of the most recognisable people in the world. He could easily have been picked up. So it's absurd. And they did this to suggest that he was a fugitive, suggest that he was a risk to the public. Of course he's not a risk to the public. He opened a debate. He triggered a debate about transparency that potentially protects the public, if we get it right. I mean, the debate on transparency is fascinating. There are very good arguments on both sides. Nobody wants to be insecure, but we want to be safe that our government is giving us the information, that we understand how we're being ruled, and that we're not being sent to war, as you know we have been too often recently, wars we've lost, that we don't really support. So you know, we need people like Julian, and we don't need to spend 20 million or whatever we spent on policemen outside. You know, the police budget, I think, could have been spent rather better elsewhere, on, you know, perhaps preventative knife crime or something.
It was all about the war in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And some people have never forgiven those who opposed that war or who post facto exposed the truth about that war. That's the truth of it, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. It is all about the war. And it's interesting with Julian, when you speak to him, it's what animates him most is the impact on civilians and people in war. That's what He really cares about that. And how many people were killed in Iraq as a consequence of the invasion in Iraq? Perhaps the most memorable thing that Julian put out there that came from Manning were those helicopter pictures of those civilians, unarmed people being shot and killed from an American attack helicopter, and the voices of the Americans.
And journalists.
Civilians and 2 Reuters journalists. So, you know, I think... and that was something that wouldn't have come out without. And we need to know what happens in our name. I feel that America, particularly, and Britain, we've lost quite a lot in the world in terms of reputation as a consequence of those wars, which we didn't support. The public didn't want those wars. These were expeditionary wars of choice, which we lost. You know, and there's no... What impact have they had internationally? You know, to what extent is what's happening in Syria today and the appalling carnage there a product of our interference in countries? And why did we do that? Was it for oil? These are questions that haven't been answered. And so just picking up on Julian is essentially to hide these things, I think, and trying to bully someone. I hate bullies, George. I hate the way that you pick on somebody. We have to find a way of dealing with people who don't fit in. Surely that's how one measure for a civilized society. We don't agree with Julian, okay, but he's forcing us to think about some things. So what do? We put him in prison, or we bully him, or do we try to find a way of coping with that and hearing what we don't want to hear? Well, you know, I think it's the latter.
Vaughan Smith, you've been very helpful. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you for having me, Julian.
Now, I haven't seen Gayatri for 2 weeks, but luckily we can see her now observing the elections in Indonesia, one of the very biggest elections in the whole world. What's rattling, Gayatri?
What's rattling? Only the world's largest one-day election. And this week, the election saw a turnout of over 80%. Over 80%. These are numbers that Britain and most Western countries can only dream of. Now, I was one of them. As you can see, my finger is still blue from the ink I dipped it in to prove that I had casted my votes. I did so in a very tiny village just outside of Yogyakarta in central Java. And I must say, this election this week, it was really spectacular. The scale of it was unprecedented because it was not just for the president, but also for the national and for the local lawmakers. So, and everything went smooth. There were no major incidents. There were over 800,000 polling stations all over the country, in the most remote areas. And they were supervised by 6 million election workers. Now, for a country that's actually only 74 years old, has been on a dictatorship for 30 years and is therefore only 20 years young, a democracy, I mean, this week's election was really quite spectacular. It was really very impressive. Now, so largest elections, lots of choices, but obviously the most important one were the presidential ones. And the race was between the incumbent president, Joko Widodo, also known as Jokowi, and Prabowo Wiranto, and he is a former army general. Now, these two have faced each other before 5 years ago during the presidential elections, and the differences between the two were then stark and clear. Jokowi, coming from humble beginnings, he was just a furniture salesman who then became successful in being the mayor of West Java, but then gained fame, national fame, by becoming the governor of Jakarta and doing a very good job at it. Prabowo, on the other hand, his past is rather more checkered. He is very closely associated with the old rule, the old guard of the Suharto dictatorship. He was married to one of Suharto's daughters, and he was, as an army general, he's got quite a checklist of human rights violations.
So it's a clear enough choice. What choice did the people make? What's your sense of what the result is going to be?
Well, I'm talking to you from Bali, where the vote casted for Jokowi is 90%. 90% is the highest. After this comes Papua with 80%, and then some other major parts, Central and East Java and other parts of Sulawesi, 70%. Throughout, from the first quick counts, as they call it, as soon as the polling stations closed, which was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the picture was quite clear. Jokowi was at 55%, close to 55% from the beginning until today.
So from what you say, it looks like the president has been re-elected.
The polls in the run-up of the election indicated so, the quick counts indicated so, and yes, I do believe he has been re-elected.
Well, hurry home, Gayatri, bring the children with you. Alas, that's the end of what has been, I think, a pretty special edition of Sputnik.
It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.